Today was mental, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Is that humming still in the background, is it?
It's something is still there, yes?
Yeah, it is.
I think my computer's on its last legs, and I think it's just... I'll try and talk over the humming.
Yeah,
I thought it was mine.
No, my computer's one of them ones you have to wind it up and hope for the best.
Mine.
It might, yeah. I think maybe you might have to talk a wee bit louder.
If I disappear at some point over the next hour, you'll know what happened to me.
Yeah, it's a low hum, but so if you kind of, yeah, you might have to raise your voice a wee bit.
That's all right.
So
I put in my earphones and an external microphone, hoping that would actually help, but I don't think it has done.
No, it seems okay now.
Yeah.
Well, maybe if I go actually closer to that. We'll work it out. We'll get there. We'll get there.
There's 36 people here.
Yeah, no, the whole house is here, so...
Oh, very good. Is that David?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, David.
Hello. Yeah, hello, everyone.
So
That's the bubble.
Yeah, Aiden's that way.
Hello.
Everyone's about. Oh, we need 3.
Aidan, you'll actually see some of the pottery that you're going to be studying.
I'm neither. Chill.
Yeah.
Portions of chips, 2 bombardiers.
Do you realise it will go quiet at 8 o'clock when the France match starts?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just going to put on a pre-recorded one.
Yeah. So, we'll give it a couple of more minutes, Brian, if that's okay.
Head on.
And we'll kick off. I'll introduce you at 25-2. So. Not me.
It's not you.
No, that's not the sound. No. No, it's definitely not me. I shouldn't mute it anyway. I should mute my phone anyway.
It was me, unfortunately. I've hung up. On silent now.
Yeah, silent here too.
I only hope my cat doesn't make an appearance this time. It's got an awful habit because I'm sitting beneath the kitchen window of jumping in and jumping up on the shoulders.
Oh, yes. Well,
has happened a couple of times in our meetings.
That's their privilege for being cats.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Have you seen the 2 little cats we've got on site?
No, I haven't had a chance to see them yet. Clinker and the other one.
And the other one, yeah. We'll not mention the other one's name in polite company.
Yeah.
Bad
Flint. Bad Flint.
Bad Flint. Unworked Flint.
Yes. So. Okay. It's 25-2, Brian. If you don't mind, we'll kick off.
Yeah, dead on.
So, okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the June UAS evening lecture. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who is a colleague of mine and a friend of mine, Brian Sloan. He works for the Centre for Community Archaeology at Queen's University, previously the Centre for Archaeological Fieldwork. Brian graduated from Queen's University in 2003 with joint honours archaeology and modern history, and he pretty much started working with the Centre for Archaeological Fieldwork after that. He's been directing excavations from 2005, and you'll know a number of the excavations that he worked on. He excavated a kist on Rathlin Island, one of a number of papers he's published in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology. He worked at Tullahogue, and he excavated a whole series of important sites at Tullahogue, a cereal drying kilns and a late medieval house. And any of you who get to Archaeology Ireland will see the most recent heritage guide that Brian and Dr. Colin Donnelly actually published on Tullahogue. His most recent excavations have been at Downpatrick, Cathedral Hill Downpatrick in 2018 and 2019. And I had the privilege of working on those excavations. And Brian's going to give us an update on the findings. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Rory, and for that wonderful introduction. You almost made me sound somewhat professional in my day-to-day work. Just before we kick off here, folks, I just want to explain my computer is very old, and you might notice that there is a slight hum in the background. I've put in the earphones and an external microphone to try and and get over that background noise. But if it gets too much for anybody, please let me know, and I'll try and do something to rectify that situation. As Rory has said, my name is Brian Sloan, for you who don't know me, and I do work for the Centre for Community Archaeology based in Queen's University in Belfast. What we're going to be talking really about tonight is the preliminary results of our excavations that we carried out at Cathedral Hill and Downpatrick, County Down, over 2 seasons. It was 9 weeks in total in 2018 and 2019. This work was carried out in association with the Newrymore and Down District Council and Down County Museum, and was funded through the European Union's Piece 4 funding stream. So we're very fortunate to be able to use that funding stream to actually carry out the investigation. The investigations in Downpatrick were really billed as what we call a community-led project, and what I mean by that is that the bulk of the work was actually carried out by local volunteers who are not professional archaeologists, or just people who have a general interest in archaeology and the history of a particular area or a particular site. And we invited them along to actually give us a hand in the excavation of this area. And they were kind of taught over the 2 seasons, the process of excavation, how to identify archaeological features and deposits and stratigraphy, how to identify artifacts and catalogue artifacts and this and the other. And we tried to give them kind of a rounded impression of what life as the day-to-day life of an Irish archaeologist actually is. Now, when I say we're going to be talking about the preliminary results of this excavation, it's really because the post-excavation programme of works is still ongoing, and you know that the excavation produced an awful lot of material and an awful lot of information that we know now, but there's still a bulk of information that we still need to get, and we've got a number of our undergraduate students using the material that we excavated from Downpatrick as topics for their dissertations as well. So we're very fortunate to have that little avenue to go down to. As with everything in 2020, 2021, the COVID pandemic has impacted the amount of post-excavation we've been able to carry out. And I think it's a testament to the staff and students at Queen's University in Belfast that this process hasn't stalled completely. We've been able to kind of trickle away at it in the background, whilst obviously we do other projects as well. And any of you that follow our Facebook page, Archaeology at Queen's, or indeed the Down County Museum's Facebook page, will know that there is quite an awful lot of information that's kind of drip-fed out as we get it, and it just goes to show that social media is such a very handy tool for disseminating this information, and we'll talk a wee bit about that later on in the talk later on tonight. So for the purposes of tonight, I think it's handy to kind of split this whole conversation down into 3 broad areas. First of all, I'll try and provide a very brief background into Cathedral Hill, into the history of the site, into what we know, what we think we know. And I say this will be brief, to go into it in any great detail would merit a lecture in its own right. And then we'll move on to discussing the 2018-2019 excavations. As I said before, it was primarily a community-led investigation, but there was a kind of a little side project that happened around about the same time as the 2018 component of the project. And this was the excavation of a very small trench on a modern grass verge right beside the modern car park. We excavated that really to facilitate the foundations for a replica high cross. And for the purpose of this talk, I'll talk about the results of that excavation first, and then we'll go into the community-led excavation in an area called the Tennis Courts right beside the cathedral. And following that, we'll try and add a little bit of context to what we found. And I think it would be prudent, because it was such a successful project, it would be prudent to ignore the whole community aspect of this project. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. So this is us here. This is the rough location of Downpatrick. It is in, obviously, County Down. It's southwest of Belfast, about 40-45 minutes in the car. You know, it's a lovely straight road, very handy to get to. Downpatrick is located in an area called McKeel, and it was a very, very important town in not just in the early medieval period with the rise of the monasteries, but certainly going into the medieval period as well. It's probably most commonly known for being associated with St. Patrick, and not least for the big parades that are there on the 17th of March, but also the fact that the Cathedral Hill where we were excavating is reputed to be the burial site of the big man himself. But again, the associations with Patrick, with Downpatrick, is a whole lecture in its own right. So tonight we're just going to concentrate on the archaeology that we encountered over these 2 seasons. Threw the slide in because I just thought it would be advantageous to kind of get appreciation of where Cathedral Hill actually sits in relation to the modern town. So this is an aerial photograph that was taken in the 1920s, and it shows Holy Trinity Cathedral sitting there in the center of the image. But as well, it gives the impression that the cathedral is actually sitting on a raised drumlin that is separated from the town, but it is actually connected to the town as well. And I think this kind of gives us an impression of like a holy site. You know, you're over there for your worship. As well, if anyone can see the cursor, just where the cursor is actually pointing to, that kind of little square field beneath the cathedral is what I refer to as the tennis courts. And it's called that because in the 1920s, this area of the site was leveled, and tennis courts were actually constructed on the site. And I think this has actually had an adverse effect on the archaeological remains in this area. Lucky enough, it left enough for us to actually get a picture of what's going on. Now, there's no the early history of Downpatrick is rather convoluted. And I have to admit, I'm only just starting to get my head around it. It takes an awful lot of kind of reading around the topic to try and get an understanding of what's going on. But I'm going to give like kind of a whistle-stop tour of the kind of main events that are happening from the early medieval period right up into the medieval period, and to what we see as the structure on Cathedral Hill today. We're not sure of when a church was first established on top of Cathedral Hill at all. We do believe that Downpatrick is actually Dun left glass, or Dunda left glass, as mentioned in the early annals, in the annals of Ulster and the annals of the Four Masters. And it's mentioned, this Dun left glass is mentioned quite frequently and with increasing importance as we go through the early medieval period into the medieval. And so it is an indication that Cathedral Hill, or Dun left glass as it was back then, is a site of real importance. One of the reasons why we believe Downpatrick is this site of Dun left glass was the presence of a round tower. Now, when archaeologists see the presence of a round tower, it's a real indication of an early Christian sort of religious site. And this is a picture of a painting taken created in the late 18th century prior to the cathedral itself being remodeled and rebuilt, and shows this image is actually showing the medieval cathedral, but it also shows the round tower located in its western end. Around about 1790, a drive was made to actually rebuild the cathedral and reuse it as a place of worship, and at that point they tore the round tower down because they felt it was just unsafe. We don't actually know where this round tower was on the site. The time came in 1997 when they came to investigate the site, attempted to find it, but ultimately failed in that respect. The Annals of Ulster first mentioned this Dun left glass in the year 496, where they say the Dun left glass is stormed. Now, there's no specific mention of a church being on the site at this period, but there had to be some sort of site of importance dating to maybe the late Iron Age or into the very early period, the early Christian period. and because no one's going to bother storming an empty hillside. But again, there's no mention of any sort of religious connotation with Dunleth Glass or Downpatrick at that time. The first kind of mention of religion that we actually get from the annals, again, is from the Annals of Ulster under the year 584. And the excerpt says, the repose of Fergus, Bishop of Dunleth Glass, who founded Kilbane. So it's interesting that, now we have a definite religious link with the site. There's then a sort of a hiatus in mentionings of Dunleth Glass or Downpatrick until 753 AD, where there's a reference to a great church at Dunleth Glass. So it's not really clear at the minute why there's that hiatus in mentions or what's going on between the years of 584 and 753. We're not sure. Reading around it seems to coincide with an expansion of the Downpatrick of kingship, and the Downpatrick were the big boys in this area, kind of a minor sub-kingdom of the larger Ulster. Around about the start of the 8th century, they start to exert more influence into the west, into lands previously governed by the Argelia, and into the north, into lands previously governed by the Downardy, including taking over Bangor, the Monastery of Bangor as well. So to me, it seems a wee bit coincidental that they're getting very big for the boots. They're expanding their influence, they're expanding their territory, and then all of a sudden you see quite a major monastery being mentioned time and time again in the annals. From the mid-8th century onwards, the annals of Ulster regularly give the dates of the deaths of bishops and abbots of Dunleth Glass or Downpatrick. So it's an indication of how important the site is at that time. As we go through the 9th and 10th century, it must have been an attractive monastery for the Viking raids. We know from the annals that it was attacked in 825, it was attacked again in 842, and then the lads came back in 989 and completely razed the monastery to the ground. This is where the annals kind of differ with each other, because the annals of the Four Masters give an account in 992, so this is only 3 years after the monastery being razed to the ground by the Vikings, that the annals of the Four Masters reports the death of Duncan, who was a teacher or a lecturer in Dunleth Glass. So this is indicating or suggesting at the very least that there was a monastic school on site in the late 10th century, and that will become important later on in the talk when we look at some of the artifacts that we recovered during the excavation. As we go into the later medieval period, the site didn't fare much better, and it still seems to be a very turbulent time for Downpatrick. In 1007, the King of Ulster's son was murdered in St. Bridget's Church in the middle of Dunleth Glass. In 1010, the abbot was blinded. In 1016, the place was burnt. In 1040, the place was burnt again. In 1111, the place was burnt again. But this time, the annals is very specific and mentions that it was actually struck by lightning and burned down because of that. This date of 1111 is also very important when we're kind of considering the history of the church in the medieval period in Ireland. And it coincides with an occasion called the Synod of Rathbrassel that took place in Cashel, County Tipperary. And this is a real kind of defining moment of the history of the church in Ireland, whereas a drive is made to take away from the monastic sort of makeup that had gone on for the last 600 years into the establishment of dioceses, and this is where we see the diocese of Down O'Connor first emerging. And I think it's very telling as well to the importance of Downpatrick, that Downpatrick is actually chosen as the seat for the diocese of Down O'Connor over very, very well-known monastic sites such as Bangor in County Down or Antrim in Antrim.
Yep, Brian?
Hello.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. There's still a fair amount of feedback. Would it be possible to hold the mic maybe closer to your mouth?
Oh yeah, certainly. Is that any better? Or? No. If I go down, is that any better?
There's still a bit of background. Oh, it's gone now.
It's gone.
Oh, no, it's back again.
Maybe if I stand here on one leg, it might.
Brian,
Um,
Brian, it's David Craig here.
Hey, David.
If you move your mic a little bit further away from your speaker, basically your mic's picking up the sound coming out of the speaker.
Is that any better?
If you have a separate volume for your speaker, turn it down, because you're not really listening to anybody until the end. It's just causing a little bit of a loop between your mic and the speaker.
So if I turn my speaker right the way down completely.
Hopefully. No, scrap that idea. That wasn't that.
That didn't work. I'm sorry, folks. It's just this laptop. Maybe if I talk louder, would that make a difference?
No, we'll keep going. Let me just see whether yeah, maybe you can talk a bit louder.
Will we go on and see how we're doing?
Yes, please. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. I do apologize about this. Everybody is just myself and technology aren't great, and you know, about a workman blaming his tools. We had just talked briefly there about the Synod of Rathgrassel and the whole restructuring of the church in Ireland, and how Downpatrick was actually chosen as the seat for the Diocese of Down and Connor. An Augustinian priory was established on the site in 1138 under monarchy, and this kind of existed right up until the Anglo-Norman invasion in 1177, when John de Courcy, following his invasion of Ulster, established a Benedictine Abbey on the site. And John basically brought a great load of Benedictine monks from St. Werburgh's in Chester over and settled them on Cathedral Hill. And it's this kind of Benedictine phase of activity is what is the majority of the archaeology that we actually encountered during our excavations in 2018 and 2019. The monastery, the Benedictine Monastery, suffered a spell during the period, as everywhere in Ireland seemed to do, especially during the Bruce Wars of the early 14th century. And it would appear that the monastery was finally razed to the ground around about the year 1538 by the then Lord Deputy Leonard Gray, and it sat as ruins then for the next 250 odd years until the decision was taken in the 1790s to actually rebuild the cathedral and turn it into a working place of worship. If we to really get an impression of what is going on here, it's valuable to actually consider the physical landscape of Downpatrick. So this is as if we're a little bird flying over the modern town of Downpatrick. It's only a screen graph from Google Earth. But if we were a bird flying over here in the medieval period, the landscape would look remarkably different to what it is now. In the early 18th century, the River Coyle was drained. So all this kind of land that you can see on the left-hand side of the image is reclaimed ground, and back in the day that would have been like a tidal marsh, a salt marsh. But thanks to modern technology, if we can actually flood the area again and get an impression of what it looked like back in the medieval period. So this gives us an impression of what the little medieval bird would have seen had it been flying over Downpatrick back then. You can see Cathedral Hill is located in this dot, and it's actually positioned on a spit of land that juts out in the tidal estuary. And this makes it surrounded on three sides by water, and this is a classic sort of early medieval location for a monastic site. It's almost like an island, and if we consider islands such as Devonish as well, this kind of separation between a religious site and a secular site seems to be very common. Just to the north of Cathedral Hill is another very interesting site. It's a site called the Mound of Down, and I think it's worth just kind of dwelling on that for a minute or two, because I'm starting to get the impression that all these areas are interconnected. And what we're actually looking at here is a fossilized early medieval and medieval landscape. So the Mound of Down looks a bit, it's better to look at it like that. That's again taken from an aerial photograph. And the Mound of Down when you're driving on the road from Belfast into Downpatrick, before you hit the roundabout where you turn left to go off to Strangford and turn right to go into the town of Downpatrick, if you look over your right hand shoulder, you'll see this major site. It's a massive earthwork, sort of oval shaped with an irregular shaped mound located in the south. Now there's disagreements with what the mounded down actually is, what it represents, and when it actually dates to. There's theories out that it is an unfinished Martin Bailey castle that was established by John de Courcy and just never finished before John moved his sphere of influence from Downpatrick up to Carrickfergus. But there's also a theory that is actually earlier, and it's associated with this Downpatrick kingship, and maybe it actually represents their assembly area or their inauguration site or something like that. In 2012, Queen's University carried out a very small sort of evaluative excavation at the Mounded Down to attempt to date the monument and to try and assign a function to it. We excavated a number of trenches around the place, and artifactually we found very little, and I think that's quite telling as well to the type of activity that was going on within this monument. It really got the impression that people were not living here. From the bank itself, from the excavation of the bank, right underneath the bank, we got samples to suggest, really carbon dates, that suggest that that massive outer bank was thrown up in the 10th and 11th century. So again, it seems to be associated with the Downpatrick kingship. Coincidentally as well, we got other features underneath that bank that were sealed by that bank, and they returned really carbon dates of Middle to Late Bronze Age. So there is a certain component of prehistoric activity at these sites as well, and we'll discuss that a little bit later when we're talking about the results of the community excavation. If we return to Cathedral Hill itself and previous archaeological excavations that happened on the site, due to the association with St. Patrick and with Dunnet glass, Cathedral Hill's been very attractive to antiquarian sort of investigation, as well as more modern published scientific archaeological investigation as well. The first real sort of scientific modern excavation took place in the 1950s, carried out by a fellow called Proudfoot. And Proudfoot concentrated his efforts on the extant banks and ditches that surround Cathedral Hill itself. And even today, if you go and stand in the car park of Asda and look up towards the cathedral, you can actually see the banks and ditches still topographically in the ground, so it's very interesting. Proudfoot also was digging in the wake of the recovery of two late Bronze Age gold hoards that were found by the gravedigger whenever he was excavating graves. So the presence of these late Bronze Age gold hoards and the quite substantial nature of the defensive features that he encountered led Proudfoot to believe that what he had encountered was a Bronze Age hill fort, and that's how life in Cathedral Hill started out. This was a very common. There seemed to be like a liking for interpreting things as Bronze Age hill forts in the 50s and 60s. And Proudfoot, to his credit, there's no reason why his interpretation at that time might necessarily be incorrect. This kind of theory survived up into the 1980s when the then head of the DOE, Nick Brannan, reinvestigated some of the areas where Proudfoot was in advance of the extension to the modern graveyard. And Nick took the opportunity to reinvestigate the enclosing ditches of the site, but Nick found nothing earlier than early medieval material, and it kind of quickly became apparent that the defensive ditches were actually constructed in the early medieval period and are associated with this early medieval monastery on the site and not a Bronze Age hill fort. So from that point, the Bronze Age hill fort idea was was relatively, was kind of forgotten about so far. We're quite fortunate in that, and quite a lot of stuff has actually been written about these early excavations in the 1950s by Proudfoot. He published all of them in our own Ulster Journal of Archaeology. And there's also summary reports in the local historical journal, the Appeal Miscellany, of Nick Brannan's excavations in the 1980s. But I think what's really missing here is one single narrative of the archaeology and the history of the site. And then hopefully what we can actually do is incorporate previous excavations with the results of our own excavations and provide that single narrative, which I can't think really of a site more deserving of it. And this would really put Cathedral Hill back on the map as being a site of great archaeological and historical resources. So our story moves on slightly up until 1997, where Nick Brannan, still as head of the DOE, invite the Channel 4's Time Team to carry out one of their 3-day excavations in Cathedral Hill. And Time Team came and they excavated a number of areas around Cathedral Hill. They looked at the enclosing defences, they looked at sort of an industrial area to the north of the cathedral, at quite a large late medieval building to the south on a Hospital Road, as well as a failed attempt to try and locate the remains of the Round Tower just outside the door to the cathedral. And the episode of Time Team is freely available on YouTube, and it's worth having a look at if you're interested in it, not least for its archaeological content, but especially because quite a few members of the Ulster Archaeological Society, well-known members of that society, actually make quite a few appearances throughout the programme. There is our very own secretary, Ken Pullen, hard at work. There is our very own secretary, Ken Pullen, not hard at work. He's probably pondering the archaeological deposits in the ground. The fellow you can see standing by the side of the trench is the late Billy Dunlop. And there's an age of archaeologists who's gone through Queen's University Belfast will know Billy well, and will probably have been instructed by him on the proper use of an on-tool shovel. Not just Ken and Billy, who are stalwarts of archaeology in Ulster, but also the leader of the Ulster Archaeological Society's survey group makes an appearance, and this is a very young Mal Conway as well. So it's really worth having a wee look at that if you get a chance. So we throw ourselves back into our own excavations in 2018. So the trench excavated in advance to facilitate the foundations of this replica high cross. And then the 2018-2019 community dig took place in this sort of triangular paddock to the immediate northwest cathedral. So we'll talk a wee bit about the high cross first and then go on to the community dig itself. So if any of you are actually ever up at Cathedral Hill, you'll notice this lovely sculpture. This is the replica of quite a finely decorated 8th century high cross that would have stood on the site. There's fragments of this cross are actually housed in the foyer of the cathedral, so anytime it's open, go and have a wee look. This replica was commissioned by Mike King of the museum. And I don't know if it's just fortune or divine intervention about where the cross was located, but on 17th of March, that shadow is shown as it goes through the high cross and shines the shadow over the entrance door into the cathedral. So I think it's a nice little clip of it. Due to the fact of where Cathedral is and the known history and archaeology that is there, to satisfy the planning conditions, any invasive groundworks need to be carried out by a licensed archaeologist, and that's kind of where the story starts with the high cross. So we went up and we excavated a relatively small hole, not really expecting to find too much. In this area where we were putting, that's one of the reasons why the area was chosen to actually erect the high cross. But it's been heavily truncated. There's an awful lot of services in the area. It's right outside somebody's front gate. It's right outside, you can see in the back of the picture on the left, the entrance into the modern graveyard. And it's a modern grass beside the car park. So we kind of got the impression that everything would be truncated, all the archaeology would be removed, and it would be a case of crossing the T's and dotting the I's and the planning permission for it. This should have been a lesson to me never to assume anything to do with Downpatrick, because the more we dug, the more we found. It kind of became quickly clear that we were actually on the site of a major medieval cemetery. Now, cast your mind away from the water pipe that's going across the centre of the trench and the two wires that are going along the top of the trench. These are actually defunct services. We had them tested, so nobody was in any danger, and we just carefully worked around them. But we came across quite a lot of human remains, and this is just a snapshot of one layer, really. In the end, we ended up with 14 articulate burials that were uncovered. We lifted 9 of these because they were in imminent danger from being disturbed and destroyed by the foundations of the high cross. And it's just one of them things, no matter where you dig a hole in Cathedral Hill, it seems that we are going to come up with archaeology. Of these 9 skeletons that we lifted 3 juvenile adults and 6 neonatal burials. And I think the presence of the neonatal burials is quite interesting, because they really are, they're medieval in date, but they're really buried in the Holy of the Holies, right in the centre of the site. It's quite interesting. I'm sure there's a story there that we just haven't managed to tease out. The bones themselves have undergone analysis by one of our past students, Lisa White, who under the direction of Professor Eileen Murphy, studied the bones and was able to tell their story. And this is what we try and impress upon visitors when we came to the site. We're not grave robbing, we're not disturbing the burials. We're really giving these people a voice again. Their voice has been lost for hundreds of years, so we're trying to tell their story, and we're trying to learn from them. We're trying to learn what the population of medieval Downpatrick was actually like. We returned 3 radiocarbon dates, so we took the stratigraphically latest burial, we took 1 from the middle, and we took the very lowest burial that we encountered. And the date ranges suggest that this was actually used as a burial site between 1031 and 1429, so between the early 11th century and the mid 15th century. So that just goes to show us that it's not like a single event, it's not like a mass grave of anybody. This is a graveyard that has been returned to and returned to and returned to, and successive burials have taken place. And that's very evident when we actually look at the burials themselves. Quite an awful lot of them had actually been disturbed by later burials, and we were only left with fragments of the burial itself. So Lisa and Eileen's work highlighted some interesting pathologies. I think it's quite important. It's an important point to actually make. This is the latest burial we actually got. It's a burial of a female. She was between 35 to 50 years old when she died, and she was quite gracile and quite short, quite small in stature, and she was estimated to have been around 5 foot tall. This person lived and died at some point between 1328 and 1429. So we're talking when the Benedictine Abbey was really in its zenith, it was really in its heyday. But the interesting thing about this person was the evidence in her teeth, and it goes to show that she must have been in quite discomfort whenever she passed away. And if we actually look at the teeth and the mandible themselves, we can see evidence of quite severe scarring on the bone, as well as very, very severe cavities. And this is an indication of quite severe infection. Now, I'm lucky enough myself. I have never had a tooth abscess, but if anybody's had a tooth abscess, even with our modern science and modern medicine pain relief, tooth abscesses are very, very sore. So it gives an idea that this person was in an awful lot of discomfort around her time of death. This is the burial we actually came across, and this is the burial of a child, and you can see it's actually disturbed. We're only left with the lower vertebrae, the pelvis, and the legs themselves. But as a child dating to the age of between 5 and 8 years old, this child died. There's evidence in the bones of possible tuberculosis, which is quite interesting. But it's the radiocarbon that I find very interesting in this individual here, in that they lived between 1031 and 1155. And the reason why I think that's quite interesting is that it's pre-Benedictine. This person knew nothing about the Anglo-Normans, knew nothing about John de Courcy, knew nothing about Benedictine Abbey, that would have stood and dominated the Downpatrick skyline for hundreds of years after this person died. The last little burial I'm going to highlight was unfortunately very truncated as well, and this person didn't actually have a head in situ. There was quite a lot of cranial fragments found in the general graveyard soil around it, so I think it's just been chopped through by a later burial. Sorry, that's my cat is just after turning up. I hope it doesn't jump on me. So this person is probably a male. I was a bit uncertain about what it actually was, but it was an individual who's between 35 and 50 years old, and quite a tall individual, you know, for the medieval period, standing at around about 5'9". But his bones showed evidence of a condition called Pectus carinatum, which translates to pigeon chest. And this is when the sternum and the chest is actually protrudes out, and you know that is a modern kind of image of what this Pectus carinatum actually looks like. So we are getting the impression, certainly where the excavation carried out, and these people that we encountered, that they weren't of the best of health, and maybe that's why they are buried where they are buried. You know, maybe they came to Downpatrick for pilgrimage, for prayer, for some sort of pain relief as well. So that's the High Cross Trench. I have to say the analysis of the bones has been completed, and once COVID kind of allows us to, once COVID packs up and goes and actually gives us a chance to get back to proper work, we are going to be making arrangements with Dean Henry Hull in Holy Trinity Cathedral for the reburial of these individuals, and there's a little spot reserved for them in the modern graveyard, very close to where we were keeping them. And we'd like to do that. You know, it's only right. These people have told us their story, and it's time for them to be reinterred. So we go on to the community excavation, and this is just another still from that YouTube video of the time team digging in what became known as the tennis courts, and you see Phil Harding digging beside quite an extensive medieval wall. And then this is another image of Nick Brown actually hunkered down over that wall at the end of filming. They excavated quite a few test pits into the tennis courts and found relatively little until halfway through day 3. And of course, it always, with time team, it always happens halfway through day 3. But I think where they came across this wall, but I think the reason why they actually encountered very little was because they were concentrating their efforts on the center of the field, and that's where everything was scarped away for the erection of the tennis courts. And we found in our own excavations 2018-2019, it's actually the periphery of that little triangular paddock is where the archaeology is actually being preserved. So time team uncovered this wall, and you can see Nick Brown just hunkered down above it. There's a big chunky, well made, well mortared together medieval structure. But the morphology of the wall is quite interesting. It's got the two sloping bits of masonry pointing downwards, and quite a lot of pottery and animal bone was actually recovered from the area at the base of these slopes. And this led Nick to interpret the site as representing the kitchen block of the Benedictine Abbey. So we would be sitting in the cloister attached to the Benedictine Cathedral. And the cloister is really your working part of the abbey, is where your kitchens are, is where your school is where the monks are doing their manuscripts and all that, and where the dormitories would have been. But due to the constraints of a 3-day excavation, the time team weren't really allowed to go into what we call the midden deposits too much, and thankfully they weren't, because they left it all for us to find. But the site was covered after, it was recorded, it was covered over, and it sat there for the guts of 21, 22 years until we turn up and re-investigate it. So this just goes to show where we're actually digging. This is our main trench. This is our midden trench there, just by the red box. And it goes to show the kind of comfortable nature of this site for carrying out a community excavation. It was just perfect. It was a nice flat field. It was enclosed by its own hedge and wall. There was ample car parking. You know, throw in a chippy van and I would have been ecstatic, but you can't ask it. You can't have everything. So this is where we excavated. We started excavating here in 2018, and we carried it on in 2019 based on the results of the initial investigation. This is our trench 2018. You can actually see we've re-investigated the wall. That's one of the rubbish chutes that you saw in the early picture of Nick Brannan. But it quickly became apparent that the rubbish chutes were serving quite deep, what we call midden pits, and these are things that are archaeological treasure troves. They're basically like a medieval wheel bin. They're just filled to the brim of animal bone and pottery and other artifacts as well. So it's giving you a real kind of snapshot into life and the working of the Medieval Monastery. And unfortunately, in 2018, the trench just wasn't. We didn't anticipate that the deposits were going to go so deep, and you can see where the ranging was leaning up against the section of the trench. That trench is really too deep. It was just getting too deep for the size of trench to be opened. It's very frustrating as an archaeologist leaving the site when you know there's more to be found, but you know, we just have to wait and come back for a second bite of the cherry. When we returned the next year, and thanks to Jackie and Ken and Gail and HED for actually allowing this, but we were able to open up quite a large area in and around what became known as the kitchen. Now, when I say large area, this trench here measures 8 meters by 6 meters. And in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at Downpatrick Cathedral Hill as a whole, it's a very, very tiny percentage. I think I worked it out, it's like 0.001% of the site. But it afforded us the opportunity to actually get down into the base of these midden pits and to try and bottom them out and see if we can get any minerals or anything like that from the very base. We are also afforded the opportunity to investigate the area around the kitchen as well, which wasn't available for the ones working for the time team. So we can actually see just where this red dashed line is, that is the line of the 2018 trench. So you can see that basically quadrupled what the area that we were actually allowed to investigate. And that's just fantastic. It's so much information. So it went from this, and over 5 weeks in 2019, we were actually left with this is what we really left the site. It transpires that there are at least 2 midden pits. There's possibly 3, possibly more going off to the north. We weren't able to bottom everything, so we were quite selective when we actually got to dig. So we bottomed 2 of them completely, and then we cut steps in so we can get in and out of the site. So you can see in this picture, you can see the sloping masonry, you can see the wall of the kitchen building, you can see the return of the wall of the kitchen going up in the foreground of the picture. But you get an impression of the sheer size of these midden pits. They're square, they're cut directly into the subsoil and the bedrock of the site, and that water you see at the bottom isn't, it's not because of a heavy rain shower. That water at the bottom is actually because the groundwater is seeping up, and this ensured that the lower deposits in the midden were waterlogged, and that's great for archaeologists because it means that organic stuff such as wood and leather and textile and all can be preserved, otherwise it would just rot away and run over the site. We find quite an awful lot of worked wood, but very, very little leather, which is quite interesting in its own right, and I'm sure there's a story there, just I haven't teased it out just yet. This is a picture. This is actually my wife, who is a dendroarchaeologist, and we had her on hand to advise us in the correct way to actually lift and wash and wrap worked wood. And you see Mary's actually working on a fragment of the medieval plank, but you can get the impression of the real clayey, sort of wet nature of the lower deposits of these mitten pits. And you know, there's a particular smell to archaeology, and you know, you would really get nostrils full of it when you were doing these. Got quite a bit of work wood, and I have to say thank you, of course, to David Craig for taking the photographs of the artifacts as they were coming out. David is a much more accomplished photographer than I could ever be, but it gives a real sense of what these artifacts are. The object on the left looks like it's the base of a handle, maybe a hammer, a hatchet, or something like that. The object on the right is quite curious. It was found together, and it looks like a wooden dial that sits very neatly into a kind of semicircular recess of that larger piece of wood. Not sure what this actually represents or what it was of. It could be of a structural fitting, or maybe of a piece of furniture or something like that. With the word wood came from these two planks, and they're not just two ordinary planks, they're actually large staves of quite a large barrel. And we're very fortunate in Queens that we have the Centre for Dendroarchaeology on board. The likes of Mary and the likes of Dave Brown can actually show us and tell us the story that these innocuous looking pieces of wood are actually telling us. So dendroarchaeology works to look at the tree rings, and the tree ring sequences will give us quite an accurate date for the felling of the tree that made these planks. But not only that, the sequence of the tree rings didn't match any samples known to Ulster. The closest match was samples that were recorded in the Wood Key excavations in Dublin. So the tree, what we're thinking now at the minute, is the tree that grew, that produced these planks, that made the barrel, actually grew and was cut down in Dublin and transported as a barrel up to Downpatrick. But not only that, the date of it is fantastic, because they were recovered from the very base of the mitten pit of 1197. So you know, you can't get better than that. But I just thought this is an interesting story, because it kind of illustrates that Downpatrick in the medieval period isn't just sitting in isolation on its wee hill into the estuary, into the Coyle estuary. You know, there is a link there with other major medieval centres in Ireland. Another one of the artifacts that's fantastic, and one of our students, Ryan Montgomery, will be looking at the bone artifacts for his dissertation. And it's this object here, and to tell you the truth, I was quite flummoxed. I didn't know what it was when it came out. It's made of bone. It's got like a sort of a handle at one end and a hole driven in the other end. And it was actually one of our younger volunteers on site, a girl called Abby, who came up with an interpretation of what this object actually is. And it's actually the tuning little keg for a harp. So the idea was the string would go up through that hole and it would turn this end to get the correct pitch in the string. Of course, the next day, Abby turns up on the site with her harp that, you know, cost in the region of £3,000. And anybody who's been on an archaeological site knows they're muddy, you know, slips and trips can't happen. And I just had all these horror images for all the paperwork and the insurance that they need to sort out if somebody had fallen and broken this £3,000 harp. But it was actually a very worthwhile exercise, because we can actually see the old with the new. So we can see the metal ones are actually the new version of what this little bone implement is. And I'd have to tell you, it was one of the most surreal excavation days I've ever had on site. You know, Abby took her harp out and played music for us while we dug. And you know, ordinarily we don't dig to music, but it was just so peaceful and so zen. And I would well advocate hiring Abby to come out to any of our excavations in the future. Anybody who's heard me talk and lament about Downpatrick before will probably know the story about this little artifact here. This was found by our youngest ever volunteer on site. There was a little girl called Annie, who was 7 years old when she dug in 2019, so that'd make her 9 now. And you know what kids are like. Kids are inquisitive. They just want to find, rude shaped stones, and they want to chop worms in half and on. They're usually happy enough and messing about in the topsoil. But Annie came up to me and asked me, was this anything? And I nearly dropped on my feet. 20 years digging, and I have never found anything as exquisite as this little artifact here. What we're looking at is what we call a bramble-headed pin, stick pin, and it's really for attaching cloth and materials like a dress pin. The decoration on it is very like artifacts recovered during the Wood Quay excavation, and this pin itself probably dates to around the 11th, 12th century date. But once the post-excavation program is actually done on the Downpatrick assemblage, all these artifacts will be going on display in Down Museum. And I think that's a nice ending to the story, because Down Museum is only a matter of yards away from where these things are actually coming out of the ground. But I kind of like to think maybe in 60, 70 years' time, when little 7-year-old Annie is actually a granny, and she can bring her grandkids to Downpatrick Museum and show them the artifact that she found back in 2019. And this is another one of our volunteers, John. And John really has become the poster boy of any publicising that we do with our excavation at Downpatrick. Probably because he's holding one of my favourite objects that was found. This John, one Sunday afternoon, was actually digging in what we believe to be a later medieval kind of pit, and came across this stone. We didn't actually see the cross under. There's a number of different cut marks on the reverse side of this, and it looks as if somebody's been using it to sharpen a knife. But the UAS president, Rory O'Boyle, took the stone away to be washed, and the next thing on here, in the middle of the Sunday afternoon, is a big yelp from Rory. And when Rory makes a noise like that, either he's found something quite exceptional, or he's dropped a bloody thing on his foot. But when Rory came over, like, none of us even expected what was on the reverse of this stone. It's quite an iconic image. It's a ringed cross, or a Celtic cross, if you want to call it a Celtic cross, and it dates to the early 9th century AD, somewhere in the region of around about 820 AD, and it was originally a grave marker. Now, obviously, it is broken, and how it ended up in a later medieval feature, we're not sure. And why was it actually used to sharpen knives then? We're not too sure. Maybe the people didn't realise its original history, or maybe they just did not care. We found other decorated metal artifacts. This is a fragment of a strap end, and it's copper alloy. We know that from the corrosion. But if we actually X-ray the piece, we can see through that corrosion, actually get a better idea about the decoration. And I'm sorry, I kind of marked this oddly. I should have kind of turned that over on the side. But what we're looking at a bird with his head turned around with the neck, and the bird's actually pecking at his wing, whether it's sitting on a branch of laurel leaves or something like that. This could be interpreted as a buckle, or it could also be interpreted maybe as a strap end of a leather strap that went around the book. And especially when we're talking about a religious site like Downpatrick, it's very tempting to think that it might go around the Bible. So one of our other students, Aidan, is going to be studying the ceramics that were recovered from the Midden Pit. And the ceramics were quite big and quite chunky. But because they've basically been dropped on the kitchen floor and then chucked down the rubbish chute into the Midden Pit, it's possible to actually piece together these pottery vessels into their original form. I particularly like the one on the right-hand side, the green glazed vessel, especially because it's got sort of false relief kind of decoration of what looks like grapes on the outside of the vessel, and maybe that's given an indication to the contents of the vessel originally. And I would bet you not an awful lot of money that it probably wasn't Drivina. But as well, there's a further story to this pottery assemblage as well. In 1960, there was a pottery kiln actually uncovered in a field to the north of Down Cathedral. So it'll be interesting to see how much of the pottery that we actually recovered during our excavations was made on site, and how much of it is actually imported. So it's giving an idea then about trade links and the richness really of the economy of the monastery during the medieval period. And this is possibly probably my favourite artifact that's ever been found on an excavation I've been on. It's made of ceramic, and it's a little head of a figurine, possibly of a cow or of a deer, or maybe of a little horse or something like that. But not only that, because it's zoomorphic, because it's obvious what the potter is trying to show here. But you can actually see, now these photographs don't do it justice, but you can actually see the person's fingerprints in the clay. So that's the person who actually made this so many hundreds of years ago. And again, we're going back to telling somebody's story. So it'd be worth to get this artifact actually scanned with a high-power scanner to see, can we actually identify the fingerprint in other pots that we got from the excavations. Again, it's just kind of a little sideline of research avenue that this excavations have opened to us. A multitude of animal bones was recovered during the site, and as I said earlier, Ryan Montgomery will be studying these as part of his undergraduate thesis. I'm not sure about the diverse nature of the animals that are represented by the bone assemblage, but all I can really tell you that the monks weren't going hungry, and they certainly were not vegetarian. But not only that, it's not only the animal bones that give us an idea about the diet of the monks during the medieval period, it's also the small things that you can't actually see. And that's the reason why we as archaeologists take soil samples on site, and this is just an example of one of them, following being processed in Queen's University. And if we go through the microscope, we can actually see the grains that they're using, the bread that they're actually making. And what we can actually see in this image is charred barley and charred oats. So it's giving an idea of the monks' everyday diet. We are getting impressions about how the place used to look. You know, we're getting lovely molded stone with lovely maker's mark etched into the top of it. Now I know this is just a simple X, but there's no disagreeing that it is a maker's mark, and somebody has etched that in, probably the person who carved the stone in the first place. Now we're not sure what this X means. You know, does this mean this side up, or does it mean I've made 111 of these and I won't pay for them? We're not sure. We also covered a multitude of roofing slates, so we know that the roof was of slates, probably with glazed green glazed ridge tiles going along the top of them. But as well, we got one single little fragment of window glass, and that's just in that bottom image there. And you know, that's fantastic. It's such a rare commodity to actually find on an archaeological site. Glass, when it goes into the ground, it's all depending on soil conditions, whether it actually survives or not. The very fact we got one little small sherd of it probably means that the rest of us just rotted away. Another excavator was over in this area of the field, and the reason we chose here was because there's a very distinct hollow in the ground in what is otherwise a really flat field. You know, people used to play tennis in this area, and there had to be some reason why the topography in this area dished. So we excavated a small trench, and it was a very small trench. It was really just a kind of look-see to see what was going on. And this is what we actually came across. The reason for the hollow was that it was over a filled-in well, and it seemed to be filled. This is only half of it. We were able in the time to excavate the complete circle of the well, and I don't know if we would have got any more information had we done it. It's not bottomed. You know, Per Rury was digging in this trench, and he was fighting a constant battle with the rising water. But a single artifact, the pottery would suggest that the well was infilled in the medieval period, so it was. And there was a really interesting artifact was recovered from the fill of the well. Is actually this fragment of copper alloy. This is Cormac Burke has had a look at this and has interpreted it as representing a fragment of a reliquary. So you know, you can see 10 small mounts and 4 larger mounts that would have held polished stone or crystal or rock crystal or something like that. And originally, if we look at the X-ray of the object in the top image, you can actually see rivet holes where it would have been attached to maybe a box containing the bones of a saint, or maybe an altar, or a cross, a wooden cross, or something like that. You know, again, this is opening up another sort of a question that archaeology just can't answer. is how the hell did this lovely piece of network end up down a well, and where did the precious stones go to? The final trench that we excavated is just as here. We located the trench here in a bid to try and see what's actually going on in this area of the site, to see that any archaeology actually survived, and I'm glad really that we excavated this trench, because it's completely changing our view of the activity on Cathedral Hill. Quite quickly, when we lifted off the topsoil, the sodden topsoil, we came straight down onto later medieval activity by way of quite a rough cobbled pathway and a stone-lined pit. Now, the cobbled path is interesting because the paths aren't just sitting there in a vacuum. They're going to somewhere and they're coming from somewhere as well. The stone-lined pit's quite interesting because it contained an awful lot of pottery, but it also contained quite a lot of copper alloy waste, kind of slag, a byproduct of copper alloy working. And it kind of gives the impression that this is a rubbish pit associated with maybe with a little workshop where they're making copper alloy objects, maybe jewelry, or maybe kind of something in the regions of the little decorative strap end that we found earlier on. This is a lovely artifact that was covered from this area. It's actually a little bone dice, dice, and it's just exquisite. You know, this thing could have fallen out of a modern Monopoly set. You know, it's that lovely and that clean and that nice looking, but it is medieval indeed. It's well stratified. But you can see with the precision, like this thing is it's less than a centimeter along the axis, and you know it's you can see the precision numbers are actually carved into it as well. Again, you got to think how it ended up in a rubbish pit. You know, did somebody lose their temper after they lost and yanked it as far as they could, or did it fall out of someone's pocket? You know, did someone see the head monk coming and they're like, oh, hide, you know? We'll just never know. But it's a lovely artifact because it shows that these places weren't just places of prayer. There are people living, working, and at play here as well. Another artifact that kind of shows a darker side to the history of Downpatrick is a quite a finely preserved socketed arrowhead of probably late 12th, early 13th century date as well. When we think back to the historical sources associated with Downpatrick and the reference in 992 of Dunca, who was a lecturer teacher, you know, I'm minded to think of this artifact here, and it's a fragment of what we call a trial piece. Now, if you think back to primary school, I can remember myself, you know, you're always taught to write in pencil, and then when your handwriting got neat enough, the teacher allowed you to write with a pen. And the same sort of thing happened in the medieval period in the medieval monastery as well, in that the monks would practice their letters and their drawings on little bits of slate before they were let loose on quite expensive vellum. We scanned this object in, and I've made an attempt to try and trace over the letters to see if we can actually make head or tail of them. And that's kind of, it's a very rough and ready, but it kind of gives you an impression of what we're looking at. I don't know if that's a capital H or an A or maybe an F or something to the left. It looks certainly like an Irish B there. Or over on the right hand side, you can definitely make out a G and probably an O. And it's very tempting if you're talking in a monastic sense to put those letters together and say God. Yep. So this, you know, these artifacts are lovely, but it's the other story that's emerging from this trench that is of prime importance when we consider the history of the site. And that's this kind of innocuous looking feature at the end of the trench, and it's the remains of a truncated ditch. If we actually look at the section of the trench, it might be explained a little bit better. So in the section you can see the remains of the stone-lined medieval pit where we found the dice and we found the arrowhead and the copper alloy slag as well. But it seems to have been excavated through quite a substantial flat bottom ditch, and the primary deposit in this ditch produced a single sherd of pottery. Now this pottery is quite interesting in that its fabric was completely different to anything else that we had found, any of the courseware associated with the early medieval Suderian ware tradition or the later medieval sort of medieval Ulster courseware pottery. It was completely different. And we had a kind of opinion, we were kind of guessing at the time, that was actually prehistoric in date. And it was only when we actually returned radiocarbon determinations for this deposit, for chart green from this deposit, when it returned a date range of 1282 to 1059 BC, that we really started to get excited. What we have here is we have scientifically dated feature dating to the mid to late Bronze Age. We have the gold hoards that were found in the modern graveyard, but now we have tangible evidence that there is extensive activity dating to the Bronze Age on top of Cathedral Hill. Now, what this feature actually is, we can't say at this stage. We only clipped it in the very end, fortuitously clipped it in the very end of one of our little evaluative dredges, just to see what actually survived in this area of the site. So to make an assertion about the function of this feature, we would need to return and open up a wider area over there and just see, can we actually trace where the ditch is actually going. There are a number of possibilities of what it could be. It could be that it is a hill fort ditch, and it was actually correct, and the whole hill fort idea is back on the table. I'm not so sure if this is Hockey's Fort in County Armagh that was excavated by Professor Jim Mallory in the 1990s, and you can just see from the sheer scale of that ditch that they're huge undertakings, they're massive features, and I just don't think the Downpatrick one is as big as this. But bear in mind, we are clipping it, so we don't have the full extent of the ditch, just on one side of it. It could be a ring ditch going around the Bronze Age burial. These are the Linford earthworks up in County Antrim. And you know, that would be very interesting as well, because it wouldn't be untoward for a Bronze Age burial site to be located on Cathedral Hill. You're in a nice elevated position overlooking the Coyle Estuary, so you know, it wouldn't be beyond the realms of doubt that this was actually a Bronze Age burial as well. But that's interesting because it's showing that it was a sacred place, if this is a Bronze Age burial place, a sacred place back in the prehistoric period as well. It could be something so mundane as a trip gully going around a Bronze Age roundhouse as well, but I don't feel it is. I just feel it's too big, just to serve to take rainwater away from thatch. And if anything, if it was a Bronze Age house, we'd expect to find an awful lot more flint and more kind of Bronze Age pottery knocking around as well. Without going back, we don't know. As I say, I'm not a betting man, but I would say it could be possibly the second scenario, that it is actually a ring ditch going around a burial. So if we take this Bronze Age activity and look at the landscape of Downpatrick again, we start to piece together the prehistoric story of Downpatrick. In the 1960s, in the Meadowlands housing development, a number of subsoil cup features were uncovered, and based on the artifacts, based on the flint and the pottery, these were dated to the mid to late Bronze Age houses. We have our gold hoards that were recovered from the modern graveyard, and they date to around about 1000 BC, give or take a week or two. We have that earlier feature I mentioned earlier on when we excavated and mounted it down in 2012, and it actually threw up a radiocarbon date of 1207 to 926. And now we have our new ditch, we have our new prehistoric feature on Cathedral Hill, which radiocarbon dates from 1281 to 1059 BC. And like, if you look at the radiocarbon dates between the mounted down and the feature in Cathedral Hill, they're very, very tight. They're very, very close together as well. So what we're kind of thinking, there is quite extensive prehistoric activity on Cathedral Hill. We start to put all the artifacts that we found over the 2 years together, and we can start making kind of conclusions of the types of activity that we encountered. In a religious sense, you know, we have our reliquary fragment, we have our possible strap end of that went around the Bible, and that's kind of putting two and two together and coming to 127, but it's a possible. And we do have our quite fine early medieval cross slab, and this is reminding us that we are digging in a place of worship during the early medieval period. Even today, it's a place of worship. We start to get a picture of what the place looked like in the medieval period with the sculpted stone and the roof and the windows. we're getting an idea of the diet of the monks through the animal bones and through the seeds and grains, but also through their kind of extracurricular activities, for want of a better word. We know they're playing games, we know they're listening to music. But not only that, but we were afforded the opportunity to actually look at the Downpatrick medieval community themselves. And I think it's only fitting at this stage to actually mention that it was quite fitting that the Downpatrick community of the 21st century actually investigated the Downpatrick community of the medieval period. Just a special shout out to this young fella. This is Oren, and he's one of our stalwart volunteers. Turned up every day, rain, hail or shine, and Oren's going to make a fantastic archaeologist in the future. I used to joke that in 15, 20 years, Oren's actually going to be my boss, and I would look forward to it. The good thing about the community excavation, the community aspect of it, is that it forged new friendships. You know, that's myself and Rory and John, just one of our volunteers, and we've all kind of kept in contact over Facebook. And John's got a real book about history and archaeology, and he's constantly contacting us and talking to us about things he's heard, things he's found as well. And not only that, but it not only kind of forged new relationships, but it rekindled former relationships as well. And that little image on the right, that's Rory and Cormac of the CCA with Dean Campbell. And Dean Campbell was a member of the crew who excavated Carrickfergus in the 1990s under the direction of Rory. And after a stint of a career change in Angarda down south, she's actually retired and is turning her attention back to archaeology. The investigations themselves were well received, and over the 2 seasons, the 9 weeks that we excavated in 2018-2019, we got in the region of 5,500 visitors to the site. And I tell you, we charged everyone £1. We could have had a hell of an end-of-site party. But, you know, we do encourage people to come in and see our excavations, because there's no point in us doing this if we're not going to tell people about it, if we're not going to disseminate the information out. And, you know, we go back to when Abby was playing the harp, you know, and this is a group of American tourists that turned up on site, and it's quite funny. They didn't want to leave. There's Rory waxing lyrical about the archaeology that we're encountered, and Abby's playing her lovely music in the background. And it was actually quite funny to see the tour guide trying to herd these tourists back onto the bus, because they had to be back in Belfast to get back on the cruise ship to go home. Social media, as I say, is a wonderful tool to try and disseminate this information to a wider audience, and this has been particularly prevalent over the last 16 months or so with the COVID pandemic. If anybody hasn't followed our Facebook page, Archaeology QUB, please do, and you can look back at the other posts of what we've been doing in different sites, including Downpatrick. This is just one example to show the benefit of social media in disseminating this information out to a wide audience, and that this one little post published by myself on the 10th of August 2019 about the little dice received a reach of nearly 20,000 people. You know, that's just fantastic. Thank you. I think we'll call it a day at that. I think I've waxed lyrical enough about the excavations in Downpatrick, but as I say, this is an ever evolving story, and it's something that an hour, I'm sorry I've kept you a wee bit later, an hour and 15 minutes can't really do it justice. So hopefully over the next months and years, more stuff will come out about the excavation in Downpatrick, and we'll get a fuller understanding of the archaeology and history of this wonderful site. We take this opportunity to thank Mike King and all the folks in Down Museum and Peace Board and the Council, especially Dean Henry Hull and the staff and the congregation at Down Cathedral, who really put up with us over the 2 years. Without their enthusiasm and interest in what we were actually doing, we couldn't have made a success of the project. The HED, you know, are great for sorting out the legal side of things and get the licenses to actually excavate the site. All the staff and students of QUB for ensuring that go on course, that you can't get away from thanking the Downpatrick community for all their interest and enthusiasm throughout the 2 years and after, because I've been admin on with this for 2 years after the post Downpatrick. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, if anybody wants to read the reports when they're written, they're going up on our website. You can look at our Facebook page, or you can contact me if you have any questions as well. Sorry, right.
You know, thanks, Brian. Fabulous lecture. I'm sorry you had to fight through the technological blips through it, but I mean, wonderful archaeology, wonderful artifacts. Would you take a few questions from people?
Absolutely. If people have questions to ask, yeah, absolutely. I'll try my best to answer them. If not, I'll bluff my way through them.
Anybody have any questions for Brian? I'll start off. Was it my imagination, or did I recall that we found a single sherd of Mesolithic flint?
We did. Now it's actually quite a well executed microlith as well. Now again, it was found in the 2018 component of the investigation. It's on display at the minute in Down Museum. My King has a small kind of selection of the goodies on display. Yes, we found one fragment of early Mesolithic flint as well, which is the earliest thing that's ever been found on Cathedral Hill. It was found in a disturbed context. It was found alongside of medieval pottery, but you know what? My argument is these things don't walk themselves up the site. That had to be dropped by an early Mesolithic hunter-gatherer. You know, so again, it's another reach back into the past further than what the obvious archaeology is actually telling us.
Well, of all the things that you uncovered over the 2 years, what do you think is the most kind of relevant find, whether it be a feature or kind of an artifact?
Well, there's so much to choose from. Probably the most important would be the now scientifically dated prehistoric feature, prehistoric ditch, because that might change our way of thinking about how Cathedral Hill actually started off. One of the prettiest finds has to be the reliquary, and I think that there's a story behind the reliquary fragment that archaeology just won't tell us. Like, how did it end up down the well? What happened to the precious stones that would have been in men mounts? You know, it's kind of like a little snapshot, possibly a conflict. We're not sure. Maybe it's to do with the dissolution of the monastery in the 16th century. But the nice shiny things were wiped out in the middle of the stone. I don't know.
There was a coin from that period found, wasn't there?
There was a coin from the 16th century actually found worn. I showed at the end of the talk there, holding up the pottery. Yeah, there was one medieval coin was found as well. When you do a talk like as I say, it's impossible to fit everything in. There's so many little tangents going off. You know, we did find a coin, but you know, that was a mid 16th century coin. But what's it in Downpatrick? When you think about what's happening in Downpatrick in the mid 16th century, you're talking about the dissolution of the monasteries. Was that one of the soldiers who dropped that when you came to actually shut the place down? You know, you got to kind of think along them lines as well. We covered so many artifacts that it's unreal. You know, you've got the organics with the work wood, they're telling a story. You've got the pottery, it's telling a story. You've got the metal artifacts are telling another story. You know, it's going to make a hell of a publication in the end. Once we actually get to that stage, it'll keep me busy for a year or two. So
it's going to be massively important publication.
Yeah, hopefully so. It's such a massively important site. And like, hopefully what we're going to do is really put it back on the map as a valuable historical and archaeological resource. You know, it deserves it. And then that's even before we even go into the whole St. Patrick thing. You know, that's another day and a half worth of talking.
This is a mischievous question. Do you think we'll ever get back?
Hopefully. COVID did a downer on us last year. And of course, you know, there's less funding streams available now than there might have been pre-2016. We'll just leave that at that. You know, but hopefully, I'm sure Mike King is quite keen get back onto the site, and as with archaeology, we've raised a lot more questions than we've actually answered. We've answered a certain block of questions, but there's 101 other questions that we've raised that I'd love to get deep into.
Anyone else got a question for Brian?
Hi, Brian. It's David Craig here.
Hi, David. How are you?
It's just a question about the Benedictine side of things. I mean,
Yep.
you've located the kitchen. I presume that's what you're thinking that is, or something connected to the
Yep.
kitchen. Does that give you an idea of the overall layout of the site? Because Benedictine monasteries, if I remember, follow more or less a predefined pattern.
Yeah,
So
the follow
do we know
kind of
where
a
the other
blueprint.
things are on the site?
Well, that was one of the reasons for the excavation of the other trenches, is to try and pick up other buildings associated with the Benedictine Abbey, and the trenches actually didn't encounter that. As you say, Benedictine Abbeys did follow a kind of a blueprint of the way they're meant to be laid out. The cathedral is down one side, and the cloister, the range of buildings, should be on the south side. But of course, in Downpatrick, where they've put the cathedral, there's no room on the south side because of the natural topography. It slopes quite dramatically right down into the town. It's an area called the Grove now, if anybody knows that area of Downpatrick. So the builders had to put the cloister on the northern side, and that's where we found the kitchen. So they are building to a blueprint, but they're prepared to change as necessary. Where the cathedral itself is located is quite odd, because it's not actually located right on the top of the hill. It looks as if it's actually terraced into the side of the hill. And the only reason I could think of them doing that, to me, to build a massive structure like that would be a lot easier to build it right on top of the hill, and then you're kind of visible from all around. The only reason I could think they've actually terraced into the side is that there was pre-existing buildings already on the summit of Cathedral Hill, and that was the only space for a major building like a cathedral, and that's why they actually put the cloister then on the northern side where there was room. That's actually funny, and there's a reference in the medieval period of a monk actually complaining that the cloister was always in the darkness because the sun was always blotted out by the presence of the cathedral itself. So, it might have been an issue back then as well. But to answer your question in a very roundabout way, no, I don't know where the other buildings are. All I can tell you that they aren't in Trench 3 and they aren't in Trench 4. Again, if we were to go back out, that is something along a wish list of things I'd like to target.
Anybody else have a question for Brian? Anyone? Well, if any questions come to mind, they can email you at Queen's, Brian.
Absolutely, yes, and I might even get back to you if my email address is there. Any questions? And I just want to apologise again for the background noise in this computer. This computer's going to go out into my own personal midden pit out the back garden. Once we're done here tonight.
Well, these things happen, but it is a fantastic excavation, and it will be a massively.
It will be. I hope, despite the background noise, people kind of got the reason why I'm so enthusiastic about it, and why it's been real. It's really been the kind of pinnacle of my archaeological career to date. Yeah. That's notwithstanding any of your excavations, right?
Thank you. Maybe when some of the students have got further along with the pottery and the bone, and
absolutely,
there's some more of the story unfolding, maybe get you back to talk about that.
Absolutely, and maybe they will join me and giving a joint presentation. They can actually tell the people about it themselves.
That would be great.
I could just see Ryan and Aidan logging off right there very quickly.
I know. The nature of archaeological research is it's always kind of evolving. So the questions and answers about Downpatrick are, there's still loads to find out. So absolutely warrant another talk at some later stage when the information.
Absolutely, we'll know a wee bit more.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much, Brian, for that.
No bother, and thank you everybody again. I apologise just about the background noise, but thank you everybody for putting up with me. I've kept you a wee bit later than initially needed.
Well, this is our last. Just talking to the membership, this is our last lecture before the summer break. Our next evening lecture will be on September the 27th, and that's Dr. Allison Sheridan, who many of you will know well, National Museums of Scotland, and she's talking about movements and connections between Ireland and Scotland and beyond, from around 4000 BC to around 1500 BC. That's Monday, September the 27th. So have a nice, peaceful, and safe summer, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. And thank you again, Brian.
Well, thank you, Rory, for inviting me.
Good night, everyone.
All right, folks, all the best.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Paul. Cheers.